peace forever and always. Welcome to another edition of the Reality's Temple on Earth. Your host is His Divine Masculine Brother AdMinister Taalik Ibn'rad.
Later that year, Dr. King brought his anti-war message to the Mike Douglas Show, where he defended his views against some surprisingly tough questions from the affable host. And an equally unlikely adversary, singer Tony Martin. Here is Dr. King in his historic appearance, which seems remarkably relevant after 40 years.
Tony, our next guest is the winner of the Nobel Prize for Peace, and perhaps the foremost spokesman for the nonviolent faction in the American Negro civil rights movement. His recent speeches and sermons urging Negroes not to fight in Vietnam have initiated a verbal argument among prominent Negroes that threatens to split the civil rights movement wide open. Would you please welcome a very outstanding and controversial gentleman, Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. I said to Dr. King, I want to put you right in the middle. I wasn't thinking. You've been put in the middle quite often, right, haven't you?
That's very right.
Dr. King, why did you decide to urge Negroes not to fight in Vietnam?
Well, I think my view has been a little distorted at that point. I haven't only urged Negroes not to fight. I feel that the war is so unjust, so abominable, so futile and bloody and costly that nobody should be fighting there. I haven't limited my concern to just the American Negro, although I know we are dying in disproportionate numbers there, and we are on the losing end both there and at home, because as long as the war in Vietnam continues, social programs will inevitably suffer here at home.
Well, don't you think that your remarks have created doubts about the Negro's loyalty to his country?
Well, some people may feel that. I don't think our loyalty to the country should be measured by our ability to kill. I think our loyalty to the country should be measured by our ability to lead the nation to higher heights of democracy and to the great dream of justice and humanity.
You honestly feel, Dr. King, that the war in Vietnam could be stopped now without harm to this country?
Well, there are two ways to deal with it. One is a unilateral withdrawal. I don't oppose that because I feel that this is a possibility. After all, France withdrew unilaterally from Algeria. It withdrew without a military victory. Mm-hmm. And this did not lessen France's prestige or influence in the world. If anything, it increased its prestige in the world.
France is not the power that this country is.
Well, I think that's an even greater reason why we should restrain our power. There's always the danger that any nation will abuse its power. And I think our power must be much more than military power. We don't need to prove to the world or anybody our military power. I think we've got to prove our moral power.
Do you feel that this nation has abused, as you say, their power?
Oh, I certainly do in the war in Vietnam. I have no doubt about that. I'm not saying that it was done with evil motives in mind. I think we made a huge miscalculation. And when you make a mistake, you ought to confess it. One of the great things about President Kennedy was that he said to the world to his closest advisors that he made a mistake in the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba, and he said, I never should have listened to the experts. And I think the time has come now for our leaders to say that we've made a grave mistake in Vietnam, and we ought to take the initiative in bringing an end to this conflict, if not through a unilateral withdrawal, at least through a negotiated settlement. And I think there are things that we can do to create the atmosphere for negotiation.
You know, Dr. King, my first question, when you said it was, you didn't say it was inaccurate, but you said it was a misunderstanding, that you didn't advise just Negroes not to fight in Vietnam. But I think it was interpreted that way. Now, how about the heroic Negroes already in Vietnam? Don't your remarks belittle their accomplishments?
Oh, not at all. I have nothing but admiration for the bravery of those who are engaged in the kind of sacrificial and suffering situation that they are in. I'm not dealing with their particular situation in terms of fighting. I'm trying to do something, trying to lead us somewhere that will bring an end to what I see as a terrible and a very tragic war, which is damaging the image of our nation here and abroad.
Doctor, may I ask you a question? Yes. Don't you feel that perhaps the parents of the boys who are now currently in the operation in Vietnam might not be in amity with your civil rights movement now because of your...
I doubt that very seriously. I can't overestimate the amount of discontent in the Negro community over the war in Vietnam. I haven't seen any loss of support in the Negro community.
I don't mean just in the Negro community. I mean, there are many of the Caucasians who are with your civil rights movement as well.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you're not disingratiating yourself, how you feel about those who have their sons in Vietnam now.
Well, there again, I think two things are important here. First, I think that the things that I'm saying and the things that I'm trying to do, and all of the people in the peace movement are trying to do, are really geared toward bringing the boys back home. In other words, we are trying to prove to be their best friends by doing something to bring about the climate that will bring an end to this war. Secondly, anyone who is committed to civil rights would not withdraw that commitment as a result of someone in the civil rights movement taking a stand against the war in Vietnam. And if they do, then they were not with it in the beginning. You stand up for what is just because it is just and right. I think it was T.S. Eliot who said, there's no greater heresy than to do the right thing for the wrong reason.
That's right.
And a lot of people do the right thing for the wrong reason. And I submit that anyone who would stop supporting civil rights because of a stand against the war on the part of some leaders ended up doing the right thing for the wrong reason. They were never truly committed to civil rights in the beginning. Truly committed to civil rights in the beginning.
Dr. King, Carl Rowan, our former ambassador to Finland, has said that your statements against Negro participation in the war have, and I quote, alienated many of the Negro's friends and armed the Negro's foes. Now, what is your comment on that statement?
Well, I'm sorry to have to disagree very vigorously with Mr. Rowan on that. I go back to the same statement that people who have been alienated as a result of this stand against the war were alienated anyway. Many people supported us in civil rights when we were in Selma, Birmingham, because they were against the brutality of a Bull Connor, Jim Clark, and they were deeply outraged about these things. And they supported us because they were against that brutality, not because they were for genuine equality for the Negro. And if anybody's been alienated, it's been because they were really not absolutely committed to the ideal of genuine equality for the Negro, and any little excuse that comes along, they will use that. But the basic thing is that they were not committed anyway.
This equality for the Negro that you mentioned, how much longer are the Negro people willing to wait for this equality, which is certainly due them?
Well, the mood in the Negro community, as you know, is a mood of great disappointment and despair and even bitterness as a result of the slow pace of progress and as a result of the fact that in some instances things have gotten worse, particularly in the economic area. And I think the impatience is very deep and the discontent is very broad. And if something isn't done with haste to remove the intolerable conditions that exist in our communities all over the nation, then I see us sinking into darker nights of social disruption.
Dr. Tony, do you believe that your remarks have put a strain on the relations of the civil rights movement? Do you believe so?
Well, not really. As I said, many people, white and Negro, are deeply opposed to the war in Vietnam. Interestingly enough, when I first spoke out against the war, only 21% of the American people were against it. Both the Gallup and the Harris polls reveal now that the majority of Americans are against the war in Vietnam. Some 48% are now opposed to the war in Vietnam. 10% remain undecided. And you have about 42% who are still in favor. So you have a majority opposed to the war in Vietnam. And I haven't seen the great opposition to my position that so many people would state. The other thing is that a man of conscience can never be a consensus leader. He doesn't take a stand in order to search for consensus. He's ultimately a molder of consensus. And I've always said that the ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort and moments of convenience, but where he stands in moments of challenge and moments of controversy. And I would take this position even if I didn't have the majority of people agreeing with me now.
Using your feeling about unilateral and the way France settled, which was very well done, they didn't lose face. Apparently, face is the important thing at this time. But not only are we losing face, but it would be better to save lives. We know that. Who will be the GOAT if someone takes upon themselves to end this war and settle it unilaterally? Will there be a constant complaint, what a big waste this one? Will this set a precedent for the United States in the future of defending our inheritance, our independence?
Well, I think we have to look at several things here. First, in my mind, peace is much more important than face. And I think there has to be a transformation here in terms of our thinking and in terms of peace. We've got to come to see now that peace must not only be a goal that we talk about and seek, but a means by which we arrive at that goal. The other thing is this, that even though the mood of the country may not be in line with a unilateral withdrawal now, I think there are things that can be done to bring about a negotiated settlement. Now, there are many people who have talked very closely with the leaders of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front, who tell us if we bring about an unconditional halt in the bombings, this would get talks going. Our government has refused to do that. And I feel that since we took the initiative in escalating the war in the air and on the land and on the seas, then we have a moral obligation to take the initiative to de-escalate it, and I think we can do that by bringing about a halt to the bombings. And our security...
Do you think that would do it, by halting the bombing? Would that do it?
Well, as I said,
bring about talk?
I can only go by men like you, Taunt, the Russian leaders, and many other people who have talked very closely with the leadership of North Vietnam and the National Liberation Front. I think we ought to try it anyway. I think we ought to bring about an unconditional halt to the bombings, and we should do that for practical reasons in terms of trying to get talks started, and I think we should do it for moral reasons. They are never going to negotiate as long as we're bombing that territory.
How about your relationship with President Johnson? Have you lost favor with Mr. Johnson?
Well, I guess the president would have to answer that question. I have taken a position against the administration's policy, and I would hope that the president means what he says when he says that there should always be room for dissent. And we come to a tragic period in our nation when we equate dissent with disloyalty. I believe firmly that it is necessary to have these moments of dissent in order to challenge something that may be leading the whole nation down the wrong path.
Do you care if you have lost favor with Mr. Johnson?
Well, that isn't, I guess, the most important thing to me. The important thing is that I not lose favor with truth and with what conscience tells me is right and what conscience tells me is just. I'm much more concerned about keeping favor with these principles than keeping favor with a person who may misunderstand the position I take.
We will talk further with Dr. Martin Luther King following these messages. We'll be right back. Dr. King, if I may, I found this in this morning's paper. Negroes hail results of Dr. King's policy. Berkeley, California, more than 4 out of 5 American Negroes believe the nonviolence of Dr. Martin Luther King has done the most to help their race, a study reveals. But about half of the same Negroes interviewed for a University of California study believe riots have done some good. Findings, which include interviews with 1,119 Negroes, were released in a book titled Protest and Prejudice. Author Gary T. Marks, now assistant sociology professor at Harvard University, reports the majority of Negroes seem to direct their hatred and anger toward the system of evil and those who support it, not indiscriminately against all whites. Can you comment on that article?
Yes, I'm very interested in hearing that. I hadn't read the article, and I hadn't read the book. In fact, I wasn't aware of it. But I think it is true that the vast majority of Negroes feel that the best way to resolve the problem is to work through peaceful, nonviolent means and militant nonviolence, but not through violence. Now, on the question of whether riots have helped, I've taken the position that riots are socially destructive and self-defeating, and therefore I have to take a stand against it because of my deep commitment to nonviolence. On the other hand, I do think a riot is the language of the unheard, and America has failed to hear, for instance, that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last 10 or 15 years. I think it has also failed to hear that large segments of white society are more committed to tranquility and the status quo than to justice and humanity and equality. And in that sense, I think the riots have called attention to something. Not that they have brought about social transformation, but they've called attention to a very serious problem in our society. But I couldn't say that they have been helpful in the sense of really bringing about structural change. I haven't seen any basic change that has come through riots. The changes that we have made and the changes that we've seen over the last 10 or 12 years have come through powerful, watershed, nonviolent movements.
Well, have the militant leaders taken over the civil rights movement, in your opinion?
Well, there again, I think a poll like this reveals that most Negroes are still following the leadership of those who feel that the problem must be worked out through nonviolence. After all, riots have been engaged in by a very small number of Negroes when you think of the fact that there are some 22 million Negroes in the United States. Now, when you use the word militant, I think it is possible to be militant and yet nonviolent. I think I'm militant. Militancy means persistent, to be demanding, to be insistent. And I think it's possible to be militantly nonviolent. And these, I think, are going to be the leaders who will lead us through this very tense period of transition.
Doctor, what do you think of the approach of this Soapy Carmichael and the H. Rap Brown?
Well, naturally, there are philosophical disagreements I have with both Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Brown. But I always have to say...
Have you discussed these disagreements with them?
Oh, very definitely. I know them very well.
Do they agree with you?
We work together in the movement a good deal, and I'm sure they would disagree with me on a number of things.
In other words, they're not too friendly with you sometimes.
Well, that's quite right. But in answering the question about them, I always go beyond them because I think they are products of the problem rather than causes of the problem. And I always have to think of the fact that it's very easy to take our visions from the causal basis, from the root of the problem, and see the consequence out here and begin to major on that. Neither Reb Brown nor Stokely Carmichael created slavery. They did not create slums. They did not create unemployment or underemployment. They did not create segregated or qualityless schools. And they didn't start a war in Vietnam. These things were started by other forces in our society. It was Victor Hugo who said once, where there is darkness, crimes will be committed. The guilty one is not merely he who commits a crime, but he who caused the darkness. And I think we have to admit that these men didn't cause the darkness. They are the products of the darkness, and this is their bitterness.
How about their following? Do they have a growing or important following among American Negroes?
Well, I would say among the young population, there are those who are listening more to Mr. Carmichael and Mr. Brown. I wouldn't say that they have a large following. I still think it's a minority. But if conditions do not change, if they are not made better, and if programs do not emerge that really go all out to get rid of the deprivation surrounding the life of the Negro, then they will probably have a greater appeal.
What will this do to the power of Dr. Martin Luther King at that point?
Well, I never like to discuss Martin Luther King's influence for fear that that is suggestive of your modesty. I'm just trying to do a job, and I think it's a job that has to be done, and I'm not trying to do it merely for myself, or merely for my children, or merely for the Negro, but for America, because I think it's true that if this problem isn't solved, the soul of our nation will be lost, and the only way to redeem the soul of America is to remove or to eradicate racism in all of its dimensions.
Dr. King, in the past you've been accused of having communist sympathies, and since your stand has to help the communist cause, aren't you concerned that these allegations will be revived?
Well, they are always revived. I hate that McCarthy eras tend to live with us, but I don't really worry about this. I know my own views
Are you a communist?
too well.
Are you a communist
Absolutely
sympathizer?
not. I have never been. I am not now, and I never will be in terms of the philosophy of communism. I happen to be a Baptist preacher, and I don't think you'll find too many Baptist preachers who would be communists. I think communism is based on a metaphysical materialism and a kind of ethical relativism and a crippling totalitarianism and a denial of certain human freedoms that I consider basic, First Amendment freedoms that I consider so basic that I could never be a communist or prefer the communist way of life. But I do feel that we've got to recognize the fact that communism is in the world, and we're going to either have to have peaceful coexistence or violent co-annihilation.
Dr. King, we have certainly appreciated your stopping by today. We have enjoyed this visit very much, and thank you so much. Enjoy meeting you. We'll be right back.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I don't think any of us can be satisfied in the United States until that war is brought to an honorable end and American soldiers are brought back here to the United States of America.
One day, we will have to stand before the God of history. And we will talk in terms of things we've done. And it seems that I can hear the God of history saying, that was not enough. But I was hungry, and ye fed me not.
This is a CBS News special report.
Dan Rather reporting for CBS News from New York. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was shot to death by an assassin late today as he stood on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. Dr. King had planned to lead another civil rights march in Memphis next Monday. We got the latest on the story now from Russ Hodge, news director of WREC-TV in Memphis.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. And police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something.
Did they know about Martin Luther King?
We left it up to you to let it can be handled.
Could you lower those signs, please? I have some very sad news for all of you, and that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis. Martin Luther King dedicated his life to love and to justice between fellow human beings. He died in the cause of that effort. In this difficult day, in this difficult time for the United States, it's perhaps well to ask what kind of a nation we are and what direction we want to move in. For those of you who are black, considering the evidence evidently is that there were white people who were responsible, you can be filled with bitterness and with hatred and a desire for revenge. We can move in that direction as a country, in greater polarization, black people amongst blacks and white amongst whites, filled with hatred toward one another. Or we can make an effort, as Martin Luther King did, to understand and to comprehend and replace that violence, that stain of bloodshed that is spread across our land with an effort to understand, compassion, and love. For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed, but he was killed by a white man. But we have to make an effort in the United States. We have to make an effort to understand, to get beyond or go beyond these rather difficult times. My favorite poem, my favorite poet was Aeschylus. He once wrote, "Even in our sleep, pain which cannot forget falls drop by drop upon the heart, until in our own despair, against our will, comes wisdom through the awful grace of God." What we need in the United States is not division. What we need in the United States is not hatred. What we need in the United States is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, feeling of justice toward those who still suffer within our country, whether they be white or whether they be black.
Senator are you going to counter Mr. Humphreys in his backgrounding you as far as the delegate votes go?
You think it goes back to struggle for it?
Somebody said Robert. Oh, my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot in the head. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. He has fired the shot. He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me right at this moment. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. Be very careful. Get the gun. Get the gun. Get the gun. Stay away from the gun. Stay away from the gun. His hand is frozen. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. Get his thumb. Okay, now hold on to the guy. Hold on to him. Hold on to him, ladies and gentlemen. They have the gun away from the man. In this shot, they've got the gun. I can't see the man. I can't see who it is.